Hello, my listeners, and welcome to episode 35 of the Fire Rescue Wellness Podcast. I am AZ, and I'm your host. And today I sat down with James Geering, retired firefighter and host of the Behind the Shield podcast. James and I covered a lot of topics, and I know you're not going to want to miss it. So please, if you enjoy the episode, give it a like, a share, or subscribe on your favorite platform. Thank you. Thank you for joining me on the Fire Rescue Wellness Podcast. I'm your host, AZ. I find the research and resources and then provide the fire service with the so what, now what, to ensure the health and well-being of every member of our profession. Together, let's thrive. Welcome back to another episode of the Fire Rescue Wellness Podcast. I have a very special guest today. Everyone say hi to James Geering, and James Geering, say hello to my listeners.
Good afternoon. I think it's afternoon with you as well, isn't it?
And if you listen to podcasts, you might recognize that voice. James is the voice behind the Behind the Shield podcast, which has, what are you up at, James? 760 some episodes now?
727, I think it is. So we're getting there. Shooting for that 1,000.
I was a previous guest on Behind the Shield, and it was a wonderful experience. So I hope to give James the same experience today. Wish me luck. I'm crossing my fingers. As with every episode, James, I get started with my 3 rapid fire questions. Are you ready?
I am, and you emailed them to me, and I forgot to read them, so this is going to be off the cuff. Just transparency there.
And here's the thing, James. Usually I have a ton of notes because I want to make sure and cover all the topics, and with you, I just feel like this is going to be a very organic conversation, so let's get into it. The first one, it's going to be easy. Who is James Geering?
I would like to think that James Geering, when I look back as a little boy, was a kind person who was raised by 2 amazing parents. And on the farm that I grew up, we had so many different types of people walk through. We had everyone from gypsies to member of extended royal family, because my father was a equine veterinarian. Lost my way kind of in my late teens and early 20s, became for lack of a better word, kleptomaniac. I don't know what the hell and the whole mental health thing happened, but yeah. And then found my way back into the fire service and refound that kindness and compassion and desire that I had as a little boy. So I think honestly, I'm one of so many people just like you and a lot of people listening, I'm sure, that wear a uniform that just can't stand watching people suffer and want to be just a tiny piece of the solution.
That's a great answer, James, and that's probably how I would have answered the question, who is James Geering too, although I didn't know about the kleptomania. Fun fact.
I don't say it very often.
All right, James, what sets your soul on fire?
Community. Yeah, I think there's been so much divisiveness, especially the last 3 years or so. And when you find yourself immersed, and I always hold my crew in Anaheim Fire, Truck 1. We had what we were the United Nations crew. I was from England. My partner was from South Africa. My driver was a Mexican-American, and then the front passenger, Terry, he was pink, whatever you describe that. And it was the most incredible feeling to be part of a truly cohesive group. Those men were at my wedding. I think it was almost 10 years later. And I'd moved away from that department for probably 8 years by that point, something like that. Anyway, and so I think that's it. When you see community in a tight-knit firehouse, in a CrossFit group, in jiu-jitsu school, whatever it is, that is what we're missing. That is that tribalism that humans were founded on. And so when that is ignited somewhere and I'm a part of that group, that really sets my heart on fire. And the same thing exists in the family home as well.
I love that, James. And then finally, I know the question to this, but I need you to tell my listeners, how are you changing the world?
We are changing the world, but how I'm trying to be a part of that is I have a very unique perspective being from another country. And then when I joined the fire service, I started in Hialeah, Miami area. Then I worked in Anaheim, California for a few years as a tillerman on a truck, and then went to Orange County, which is the Orlando area. Very, very busy, high tempo department. And then I transitioned to my last place, which protects Disney. So I got a very unique perspective on all these different departments, East Coast, West Coast, coming from an international perspective as well. And so I just think it's a different voice. So what I'm bringing to this movement of people that I think that are really truly trying to change is from the outside of the fire service. A lot of our men and women transition out and they retire and they want to move on. I deliberately stepped out of the fire service because I don't think that you can advocate 100% without being outside, because so many of us are shackled. We get disciplined if we say certain things, or we get emails saying you can't do this anymore. So bringing this perspective, and then the background of I'm an exercise physiology graduate, I'm a coach, I'm an athlete. So understanding the wellness arena that you and I both understand well, and then seeing some of the wellness information in the fire service, there's a disconnect. So I want to bring some of the greatest minds. I mean, you're in the NSCA space as well, the neuroscience space. So some of these experts that we have into our profession to educate our men and women. Here's what we're doing really well. Here's what we're doing very poorly. This is causing these physical and mental health problems. And so I see myself as a conduit. I'm not on this podcast or my podcast monologuing. I'm bringing the great minds and just connecting them with the people that need to hear it.
Outstanding. I love that. And James, I think I told you this before, but it's worth repeating. When you stepped away from the fire service, I thought in my head, that is the most amazing thing I have ever seen anyone do. And oh my God, I am too scared to do it myself. So you are the trailblazer. I couldn't follow you, but you're the trailblazer. But you stepped away from the fire service for several reasons. But one of them, I think, is my perception, was the wild success of your Behind the Shield podcast. Is that correct?
So the universe basically put me in a position, and this happened pre-divorce as well. The universe basically grabbed me by the throat and said, look, this is the situation. This is what's going on. It's time to move on. I won't get into specifics, but it happens sometimes. The same thing happened where the last place I worked for, sadly, should be one of the best fire departments on the planet. And it was the polar opposite. So after 5 years of trying to make a difference, it wasn't like I left this rock star crew and I was just fighting fires every day. There was a lot of frustration, a lot of, swimming upstream. So that was part of it. But, the other side was, yes, I love the Green Beret philosophy, being a force multiplier. So I'd been a fireman for 14 years, been very, very lucky, an absolute shit magnet, black cloud for, so getting a lot of calls and a lot of tragedy and death, sadly. But I felt like I never bought into that, oh, you want to make change, promote. I don't believe that is a thing. I really don't. There's still shiny pins on your collar don't mean anything really. But it could mean, you could be a great leader happening to wear that uniform. So what I realized is I can get on a rig, and that, in most of the fire service around the country now, we're going to run a lot of probably shouldn't even be a 911 calls. And then sprinkled amongst them are going to be some structure fires, some extrications, and some truly pre-code life-saving events. And so I realized by this point, thousands of people were listening to these episodes as they aged. For all this time, if I can get to 1,000 people with this guest, or 2,000, 3,000, in the time it would take to do one shift where I may or may not be a part of something. And if I step away, another body's going to fit in there, which is a big thing that we all struggle with. The machine will keep working without you, but this thing isn't out there yet. So that was the big thing. I wasn't making money. I cashed out my pension to pay myself for a year and a half to buffer. So I have no pension now, but it was the best thing I ever did because it allowed me to speak from a totally different platform where I'm not wearing the uniform anymore, but I did. So you have the buy-in. but use my experience to ask good questions of these experts who more often than not haven't spoken to a firefighter specifically before, and then bring their knowledge into us. And that can be accessed for free. There's no Patreon, there's no VIP access. So whether you're in, Mumbai, Malaysia, or Orlando, you can access the same wisdom for free. So that was really it. I saw the impact it was having. I saw these numbers increasing. And unlike a like on social media, which sadly I have so many likes on the most stupid videos and very little likes on the ones that actually mean something. If someone hits play on a podcast, that's an opportunity for someone to learn, change their life, or maybe even save their life. So
I hope I aspire to have as much impact with my podcast as you have with yours, because it's really a fabulous resource. And I think I also may have mentioned to you before, I wasn't a real big podcast person previously, but my friend George Carvajal, common friend, had been on an episode of a sport performance podcast at some point, and I listened to it, and I was like, oh, this podcast thing is kind of cool. So the next podcast I fell into was yours, and the first episode I listened to was your first episode with Dustin Hawkins, which was, I couldn't breathe, James. I could not breathe while that man was speaking.
He's amazing. And when people say, if they just discovered the podcast, and it's a shame because I think I've got to figure out how to do this, but if you look at my podcast on iTunes or I think Spotify, it only goes back to like episode 200. And there's obviously, that must have been when I connected with that particular site. So I'm not very technically adept, but I'm going to get someone to try and fix that. But yeah, I tell people, listen to episode 6 with Doc Kirk Parsley, because that blew my mind with the sleep thing when I heard him on Barbell Shrugged. That's one of the reasons I started this podcast. And then Dustin, I think he's 39. And that was the first time someone had really bared their soul on the show. And I had so many people tell me, dude, I was in the gym on the rowing machine. 1 minute I'm laughing, and the next minute I'm crying. People thought I was insane. But it was Dustin's courage and vulnerability that connected with so many people. And when you listen to all the things he's been through, and now I think we talked about it in the last conversation, his wife Lynn is battling cancer, and just the most beautiful, resilient couple. But this is the real human experience behind the mask. And Dustin was one of those men that truly has courage, not a two-dimensional Rambo manliness, but a real manliness to actually share his story, which I'm sure his story alone has probably helped countless
undoubtedly people. And then your episode with Chris Fields, the biggest take home I absorbed from that was, if you've got a story to tell, you need to tell it. And so that, in fact, was the reason I sort of started telling my story. So I'm just going to tell you, listeners, if you have not been into the Behind the Shield podcast vault, it's time to dig in. It is time to dig in.
Well, just a heads up as well. I'll say this because I only did it, I think it was about 3 or 4 weeks ago, but I added a search function to the website, which is jamesgeering.com. So now if you want to put in mental health, sleep, back injury, whatever, in the search, it should bring up the appropriate guests. It's probably not perfect, but if the bio has mentioned it, then because when you go to 700 and whatever episodes, it is kind of not daunting, but you're like, where's the ones I want to listen to first? Where are the ones that I'll really connect with? So just to let people know, if you look at the podcast app and there's nothing that really jumps out, then go to the website.
I love that. That's great advice. All right, James, you said something that actually triggered my brain to go in a direction. And you said, more or less, if you leave, they're just going to fill your seat with another butt, which has been historically easy to do. Simple. Hundreds of people on an applicant hiring list wanting that job, waiting breathlessly. But I don't know what you have going on in Florida, but we do not have that anymore in Illinois. We are having problems recruiting people. We are having problems retaining people. Big problems. And so I'd love to get your perspective on perhaps some reasons you might think that's happening and then some solutions. Let's solve this problem.
So I think there's a multi-pronged element, of course. I mean, every problem has more than one issue, but one thing I've seen just on the front door element that I can again attest to, because I've been a part of a department that held the standard extremely high and one that they dug a trench and put their standard in there. Anaheim, when I worked there, every single new hire class through attrition, they would lose about 25%. So just because you were hired doesn't mean you're going to make it through probation. And it was the same with the class I was hired with. And when I tested to go back east, I hopefully was humble enough to realize, even though I was in great shape, I did a practice CPAT in California to go and smash it when I go back to Florida. And the guys running it were like, "You're the first person I've ever known that's left Anaheim Fire Department." When I tested for Anaheim, and this was in 2005, 04, 05 is when I started testing with them. I tested against 1,000 certified firefighters or EMTs. Were all either wildland firefighter experience as well, ambulance operators, volunteers, cadet programs. Their resumes were stacked. I think the fact that I flew 2,500 miles probably helped me, on that as well. And I studied diligently for the tests. But this backwards philosophy that if we lower the standards, more people will walk through our front door, I think is one of the main issues. All it does is it lowers the standards. It makes it less desirable for the real fired up men and women in the fire service to want to climb to that bar. And then you obviously, you're without sounding disrespectful, you're kind of scraping the bottom of the barrel too if you're not asking people to climb to the standard. But I feel like that when you set it, the Navy SEALs, the Green Berets, the SAS in the UK, you're going to have a line out the door, but if you're 18 and a heartbeat bums on seats, I've watched it be completely different. The other side, and this perfect example, is where I live, Marion County. They've just had 2 firefighter suicides in the last 3 weeks. They work a 56-hour week, no Kelly. And this is a somewhat affluent area, a lot of horse farms. They just built this enormous facility called the World Equestrian Center. I mean, there's a lot of money in this area. So 56 hours, and they were on near minimum wage as well. But then because they have that 18 and a heartbeat mentality, and they're known for beating the hell out of their people, they're becoming more and more short-staffed. So now the men and women that protect my family are now getting mandatory over and over and over again. So that 56 becomes an 80-hour work week. And I sat down with a couple of people from their department, and I told them about what I think should be the industry standard, which is 24/72, which is a 42-hour work week, and the fact that there's resistance against working a 42-hour week when all civilians do blows my mind, that we're awake all night and protecting lives. But they're like, "Oh, we can't even staff it now." And that was my point. It's like, why do you think that is? If someone comes in, you said you're probably going to work 80-hour weeks, how many people are lining up out the door? So this is the other thing, is this lowering of standards, this lack of true leadership, where you just say, like, we are filling these seats. We are going to get these people in. We're going to set this bar high. We're going to recruit as many people as we can. That, I think that's it. I'm kind of stumbling my words. If you've, as a profession, advocate for a much better working environment that allows people to thrive, you will probably have those lines out the door again. But I think in general, the fire service, and I'm sure law enforcement's probably suffering even more, when people are like, yeah, it's a meat grinder in there, the most passionate of us are still going to go in despite, the same way as people volunteer in the fire service. But that middle pool, a lot of them go, "Oh, I can go work IT over here, or I can do this." And you could argue, well, you should probably never have been a first responder, but there is an element where you've still got to come home to your family. You've still got to do other duties. And if you're just exhausted, and you're watching friends like I do that were hired 4 or 5 short years ago and are just ghosts of who they are, and they're on exogenous testosterone and antidepressants, is that the environment that's going to draw people in and excite them? I say no.
I say no as well. I also would argue that because we are becoming more aware of the mental health challenges presented to us due to sleep deprivation, due to trauma, that our younger people, who are smarter than us, by the way, those young people are smart. I think they're looking at it and saying, no, thank you. I'll go be an accountant.
Well, I think you've got the other element too, and I hate this kind of looking down at younger generations because I have a lot of people that say a lot of their candidates are fitter than they ever were. But I think if you still look at statistics, if we have a population that's getting sicker and sicker, and we've heard this rhetoric where this is the first time that some generations, some parents are going to outlive their children because of this health crisis that we're in. Well, that obviously, and I had a guy called Dan Bornstein who kind of underlined this, that's just shrinking your pool of people. So say out of 1,000 candidates, you had 100 that were fired up and going to be phenomenal. Well, now if you've only got 500 candidates, now you've only got 50 that are in that top tier. So that is another element too. What are we doing? And as a profession, we do a horrible job of educating too. Like how many people in 2023 are told, why is there a fire engine on my medical call? We've been doing EMS for 50, 60 years. That should not be ever uttered unless you're in the Northeast and for the first time you've brought in EMS. But for most of us, we've been combining these for a long, long time. So it's all these compounding elements together. And I think that sadly we're at the Jenga moment where everything's about to come crashing down. So if we don't have a real change and educate our men and women, which you're trying to do with the podcast too, on exactly why they're going through these things physically and mentally and emotionally, and how it is all preventable, and then what we brought into the profession is another huge part of the conversation. Rather than check boxes and do polygraphs and psych tests, how about we give them counseling at the front door? Get rid of the polygraph, get rid of the psych tests, and give them 5, 6 counseling sessions as they go through the academy or the first 3 months. Now you've given them a chance to process things that they maybe brought into the profession, made them more resilient, and you've created an incredible relationship with a counselor from day one. So it's not, I need to call EAP and do the Russian roulette of counselors. I actually know I'm going to speak to Sarah or Steve. So this is what frustrates me so much. There are so many solutions, but the fire service is so siloed that everyone wants to reinvent the wheel rather than actually drop their egos, ask the real experts in the world, and then knowledge share that we can, share this and affect all of our departments and raise everyone up. But this city or county sucks mentality is the very thing that's stopping us from progressing. I
love that you brought up Dr. Bornstein. He was actually my guest just this week on the podcast. And so I'm going to link both James' episode and my episode with Dan in the show notes. But in case you missed it, the physical fitness of the United States of America is becoming a national security risk. We are falling behind other countries with our military and also our police and fire service because we're all dipping into that same well for candidates. So it's a big deal. So go back and listen to those episodes. Here's my thought, James. The young men and women that are coming into the fire service are smart. They're savvy, way smarter than I was. And they're interested in their health and wellness far more than most of the people in our generation or era were. And so my big push is to provide them with professional services, not train the trainer, not another firefighter trying to write them a nutrition program, but provide them with professional services. How do you think we can get this done?
I just got off an interview with Chris Houth, and he is one of the elite kind of ultra marathon triathlon trainers, and he's training our runners for 7X that I'm about to go on around the world. And he said, and I don't know exactly how he came across this, but he's worked with first responders and special operators, and he said Division 3 athletes get better access to strength and conditioning, nutrition, etc., than our first responders whose lives, people's lives count on. So I think it's just like I said, it's removing those silos. There are so many great people. I mean, you have, services that you offer. I mean, we've got all these different people. So there's enough, especially with the online community, there's enough access to resources, but it has to be a unified kind of nucleus to all this. With this silo element, it's creating walls where we need to actually hold hands, metaphorically. So I wish I could say an organization, the IAFF, was this great network and, they disseminate this great information, but it's just not, and I love the philosophy of unions, but I've been so disappointed. I paid for 14 years as a member. Every time I needed something, they were told me it was an unwinnable case. And then, but then they would bail out some turd and get his job back that had no business being in the uniform in the first place. So that aside, we need to have an organization like a union, but it's for the wellness side that truly networks and integrates every single fire service from volunteer to paid on call to career, and disseminate this and have access to a library of resources so someone doesn't get the monopoly on this, but to educate them, because this, as you kind of touched on, this is what drives me crazy. They'll send firefighters to, a mental health weekend or a fitness weekend, and they come back as the experts, and they're not. They're adjuncts, absolutely, and some knowledge is better than none. But why do that when you can go to Jeff Nichols or Matt or so many other people that have worked with these elite professionals and access their. You don't even need to ask them, hey, can you write a program? They already exist. You've literally just got to go there and download their workouts. So it's just communication. I think the work has been done in so many of these areas, even in sleep deprivation. The research is there, but the fire service wants it to be done on the fire service. Well, they've done it on the Navy and the trucking industry and the airline industry and everything else. If you're not open-minded enough to see that these are human beings in these positions, then you clearly just don't want the answers. So I think it's communication. The resources are absolutely there. How do we create a reliable network that isn't self-serving, that will simply give our men and women access to these resources? And then your department says, okay, I'm going to pay for Matt Wenning. I'm going to pay for Jeff Nichols. I'm going to pay for O2X, whatever it is. Here's your resources now that you can start dipping into.
I need you to poke holes in this idea, James. And here we go. The research is clear that health and wellness interventions, even very basic ones, return on investment is at least 3 to 1. Now, there are examples where it is 10 to 1. Huge return on investment. The research is there, but that's still not compelling enough for most fire departments. So my argument is, we already know that the monetary return on investment is there. How about now we look at return on investment and quality of life for our employees? And we do it because it's the right thing to do. How do we get the fire service to buy into that?
I think you got that completely backwards, and it shouldn't be at all. What should be the buy-in, without any persuasion, is the health of your people and the performance of your people. And I think it's the opposite that is needed in most of these cases. And it's so sad, but I'm actually working on a project. I tripped over the fact that we have one of the most revered research facilities on the planet in my town. Their main one is in Pensacola, but there's a satellite office in my town. A local businessman has put up some money to try and finally bring some solutions to the mental health crisis. So I'm working on trying to get a revered research organization that works with NASA and DARPA and the SEAL teams and all this to collate this information. And there's going to be performance, there's going to be longevity, but there's going to be the financial side. We are all servants. We understand service. We understand selflessness. Sadly, either people forget that when they climb the ladder, or they're in government organizations that we work for and they've never even known that. And so the money side is the big thing. But I don't think, because again of that lack of, so-called lack of research, when someone gives a piece of it, oh, look, this is what they saved over here. Oh, well, that's different. So I think, and I hope this is going to be part of the solution, when an organization that works with the most elite performers on the planet lays it out, and they've got neuroscience, they've got all this thing, all these different departments, we have to have an irrefutable document that collates this research. I mean, the perfect example, the naval industry, one shipping collision, and so many have been rooted back to sleep deprivation. Some of them, we've actually lost sailors in these collisions. That costs millions, if not billions. The Exxon Valdez, I think one of the oil rig explosions was also from that, if I'm not mistaken. So yeah, you think about the fire service, the cost of a lawsuit. You and I work on a patient. I pass you the wrong med because I'm so tired. You don't notice because you're so tired. And then we just, we killed someone. We hit someone at an intersection because I had a micro sleep driving through it. The workman's comp claims, the overtime to cover me while I'm off with my knee or my back, the medical retirement. I mean, all these things, when you add those up, like you said, it's got to be 10 times, when you compound all these different elements. And then, as you mentioned earlier, this environment we have at the moment, what this local department is seeing is they're spending 15 grand hiring, clothing, etc., training young firefighters. And then they're like, oh, so-and-so's hiring, I'm out of here. And then they're gone. So you got to factor that in as well. So when you add all this bleeding of finances, I think that's how you persuade the employers. It shouldn't be the case. Many of them probably spend Sundays or Saturdays in a religious building where their teachings tell them to be kind and compassionate, and then they come back and have no issues with their responders working 80 hours a week. So I think that underlining the true economic element and how, I don't know, maybe you could open that browned out station now that you've stopped paying all this money on the back end. So the financial side, sadly, I think is how we really get the foothold in this issue.
And my latest and greatest idea that I'm hoping to get some footing on with my administration is we already know we're having a hard time recruiting and retaining. So let's look at those people that are considering retirements and see how we can sweeten the deal for them to stay. Because although they're on the higher end or the high end of the pay scale, they're trained, and it is a tragedy to lose those people just because they don't feel like being there anymore. So how can we sweeten that deal enough to get them to stay? I have ideas. What do you have?
I would just play devil's advocate because the way that we work our responders, the people at the end of their career, I would be wanting to leave. The sooner you can get sleep and everything, especially as you're at the back end. But to kind of caveat from your idea a little bit, say that staffing wasn't an issue. When our people retire, even like statistically, if I walk out the back of a fire station and then, get hit by a car, I'm not even in the statistics anymore. If I blow my head off, whatever, the moment I'm off the books, I cease to be a statistic. So our cancer numbers, for example, are probably a fraction of what they actually are, because once, again, Steve or Sarah has left, how many people really check in on them anymore? I think it was Walt Lewis had a great idea. Get our retirees in mentoring the young firefighters so you don't lose the knowledge. You still allow them to go home and sleep and start repairing all the damage they did in a lifetime of shift work. But you keep them connected to the fire service if they want, and you bring them in almost as like contracted trainers to keep imparting their knowledge. Because, if you're a new firefighter in 23, you're just not going to see much fire in a lot of areas. So there's a lot of wealth, a lot of knowledge. Even I got hired in 2004. So again, it wasn't like we were burning everything to the ground then. But if guys were on in the 80s, 90s, the knowledge that they had from the frequency of fires, they may not be the gurus in EMS, but why let that knowledge and experience just disappear? Keep them connected so they're still connected with their tribe, and allow them to mentor our young guys and girls.
I think that's a great idea. I really like that, James. One of the things that I know that you and I agree on, and I've been preaching it and you've been preaching it, but I would like for you to say it on my podcast so that someone hears it from someone other than me. There is this pervasive attitude of, I need to do physical conditioning in my gear. I'm not talking about forcible entry. I'm not talking about throwing a ladder. I'm talking about burpees and handstand push-ups and pull-ups. I'm going to just open the floodgates, James, and I want you to go.
I've had a few people discussing this. Now, obviously, the first most important one is the less time you can spend in gear from a carcinogen point of view, the better. And actually, John Spira, the guy behind Fit to Fight Fire, I don't know if they're still working on it, but they had a concept for a set of workout gear that wasn't bunker gear, but it simulated keeping the heat in and that kind of thing. So you could wear that, and then you get a real fire, and then your gear's all still in the rig, and off you go and go fight fire. But I think biomechanically as well, you just got to take a step back and go, what is applicable for fireground? I love strongman movements, and my gear workouts, when I did them, and my last place saw next to no fire, so I knew that gear was pretty clear. Before that, it was, definitely, much worse. But it was push, pull, carry, so sandbags and sleds, because at least I could say, all right, this is me dragging a dummy, this is me, advancing a hose load, this is me carrying Hamatro tools or dragging a person out. It was very applicable movement. But you see these guys doing ring muscle ups and handstand walks, and you just got to take a step back and go, this is just Instagram clickbait. You don't believe in your heart of hearts that this is actually doing anything for your training. So if you can look yourself in the mirror and say, this is simulating what I would do, stairs, perfect example. Stairs with, a pack, 50 feet of hose, 2 spare air bottles and a tool. That's a high-rise strip. That's completely legitimate. At some point, you're going to have to do it. Let's work on that mental toughness, and this is worth the sweat. But then you're going to do, Murph, throw on a vest. If you want to wear pants and a sweatshirt, do that. But do Murph. Just do Murph the way it is. And don't get me wrong, I've done Murph in gear before, and it sucks. But even then, with the helmet, the helmet is all over the place. Our helmets in the US that's a whole other discussion, but they're from the 1930s. I'll just leave that there. But so just think functional. That's it. Functional, and how many times do I want my skin to dilate and absorb what might be in my gear? And let's not forget, not only have we got the carcinogens that we are around when we're responding, you have the PFAS, the forever chemicals that are in the water barrier in our gear as well. So for me, the less exposure you can have, the better. But there does need to be time in gear and working up that tolerance to heat, because every single time I tapped out or wanted to tap out in a workout, whatever, it was always from the heat. It was never from actual physical exhaustion. So you have to spend time in gear, especially, we're in Florida, and my other one was in California. So, and I'm an Englishman working in 100+ degrees my whole fire career. So yeah, but I would say just minimize would be the word.
James, I'm going to go way back to the beginning. I think I just figured out who your officer was in your United Nations crew. The pink one, Irish?
It was Terry. No, he wasn't Irish. He was, his last name was Wilson. So technically it was I think it was English and Scottish, but yeah, Terry Wilson. Amazing. And he was the kind of guy he's still with us, but at the time, there would be a kind of moth to the flame, like, happens on so many incidents. And he was the kind of guy that would just literally get off the rig, and you knew just to stay there because Terry was thinking. And he'd look at you and give his little mustache, would do a little, moving up and down. And then he'd get back on the rig and like, all right, turn around. And we go to a completely different side of it. And we're talking like a massive fire. And then sure enough, we had a completely different exposure. There was one fire. We ended up rescuing an engine company that was stuck there. And that was just the way he was. He was that old bull. So, amazing leader, and just so calm.
Unbelievable. Well, James, I just have one more question for you. You casually, in your free time, a couple of years ago, wrote a book. So tell us about that endeavor.
So the book is called One More Light: Life, Death, and Humanity Through the Eyes of a Firefighter. And what I wanted to do is, as I said, I'm a conduit. So I didn't write a book pretending like I had all the answers for the wellness things. But what I wanted to do was take stories from my life, including my career, and then they're really almost like short stories, but each chapter is a takeaway. So one might address addiction or back injury or, strength and conditioning, nutrition, etc. Because through these conversations like we're having now, the art of storytelling, I think, is so engaging. And I've sat through countless presentations where one person is talking, and no matter how engaging they are, you still get that kind of sleepy eyelid syndrome. But the moment there's a story, you're kind of brought in. And I had some pretty amazing calls, so I got to kind of fictionalize them slightly so the real people didn't read it and realize it was them. But I think that it's a double-edged sword in a positive way. If you're in the fire service or first responder, you will identify a lot of this from within the uniform, and certainly some sleep deprivation and that kind of thing. It shows you kind of what it looks like within our profession, but then it leads you to some answers. But then, as importantly, I hope that civilians read this and go, oh, this is what our firefighters do. Because, as I said, we do such a poor job of educating the public on what their first responders do. I mean, a number of people that think that we sit around in the firehouse watching TV, and I tell people, all right, go stand on your artery road in your city. Do you hear sirens? Exactly. So why are you still believing in this, like 1930s vision of a firefighter? It's ridiculous. So that was the whole point, was to take all this knowledge I had from all these guests many of which I've applied to my own life, and then disseminate them through stories.
And it is an outstanding book. I got it both the print copy and on Audible. And yes, it was amazing.
Well, thank you.
Well, James, I always sort of wrap up my podcasts with either, do you have some parting shot for people, or is there a topic that I should have brought up and I just screwed up and left it off the table? It's your turn, James.
No, I think if I was going to leave people with one thing, is just ask yourself why the person bagging your groceries works 40 hours a week and you work whatever hours you work, especially if you get mandatory. We are asked to do so much with so little. And if you think of the acute elements of sleep deprivation, and then you hear like Matthew Walker and some of these kind of names that have got out there a bit, one night without sleep is like a blood alcohol of 0.1. Well, that sounds great, but that's assuming you're testing people that usually sleep. Imagine the first responder profession that every third day do not sleep, what that cumulative effect is. So you've got the acuity element. So I would argue that the line of duty deaths, a large portion of them were actually sleep deprivation related. These ones that get lost in searches, the ones that fall off aerials, et cetera, et cetera. The long-term impact, educate yourself again on how sleep deprivation affects mental health, obesity, cancer, testosterone, all these other areas. Once you read this, get really angry. Take a step back, ask yourself, why are we working these hours again? And then start doing something about it. Because we are so good at just showing up because we're servants, but we have been taken advantage of. And I don't think it's malicious. It's a devolution of the fire service from when we truly were in stables, petting Dalmatians. But the fire service of 2023 that I've ever worked in runs almost nonstop 24 hours a day. So we have to change the work week, and no 12s and 8s and 10s are not the solution. At 24, we have a station with beds is the way to go. But in my opinion, 24/72 should be an industry standard across the board. And if you happen to be in a quiet department, great. I don't remember seeing too many security guards in apartment complexes being told to chase robbers 24 hours a day. You're there until you're needed. So, but we have to advocate for the men and women that are running their rear ends off. As I mentioned, we lost 2 firefighters in the last 3 weeks in my town. Young, fit, healthy firefighters who, at that point, they're so burnt out amongst, as I said, childhood trauma and other contributing factors, that they truly believe that their best option was to take their own lives. And the fact that's acceptable by the IAFF and these so-called leaders in these organizations is disgusting. So we, boots on ground, need to get educated and angry. Mic drop.
Oh, you said it before I got to say mic drop. All right, you've heard it here, listeners. Get educated, get angry, and then advocate for yourself. So, James, I knew this was going to be a great conversation, and I'm so grateful for your time. I appreciate you. And AZ and James Geering are officially out.